We're going to show you the Klima Railjet 6150 from ROCO and how it can be digitized. First things first, the operating instructions and the certificate. Here you can already see the first parts of the set. The packaging looks great, and of course the item is only complete with the lower part, an 8-piece Railjet set. Before you start, you should quickly check your purchased items with regard to a few points. In this case, I'll just check that the wheel sets roll nicely and that the coupling kinematics work well. Before carrying out the digitization process, just check that the lights are switching correctly in the control car in the analog version. The exact procedure to open the control car is described separately in the operating instructions. The first step is to lift the housing slightly at the rear. This procedure is also described in the operating instructions. We can then remove the housing towards the front and we can see the opened model. To avoid scratches, we'll lay the housing on its side. You can see the bridging plug here. We now need to remove this. Sometimes they can get well and truly stuck. With the appropriate care, however, it can be removed without bending the pins, and then this decoder is inserted in there. Now we have two options. Purchase a standard item either from our range or from the spare parts warehouse. The advantage of an item from the spare parts warehouse is that it will come fully pre-programmed and functionally ready for the control car. In order for it to work properly, you will need to program the standard item in accordance with the instructions. Before closing the model, we'll perform a function check with the digital control center. The activated direction of travel forward light is switched to red by a change of direction and by pressing F5 as described in the operating instructions for the digital version. In addition, the item also has a high beam function. Now that everything is working correctly, we can close the model again. The housing was reattached to the locomotive and once again we'll perform a quick function check. We have the headlight, white, the high beam, and of course the red mode. Before we digitize the locomotive, we'll also carry out a short analog test to check that the light switches correctly on both sides. As described in the instructions, the locomotive housing can be detached by splaying it outward slightly. By loosening the housing, we have now slightly offset the front lighting circuit boards here. Later, it will be important to make sure that this light guide, which is on both sides of the upper headlight, is neatly threaded. The bridge connector must be removed. It's usually fairly well seated. Optionally, we can use a Plux 16 or Plux 22 decoder in this locomotive. In this case, we opted for the Plux 22. Thanks to the coating on one of the pins, it's actually impossible to insert the decoder into the locomotive in the wrong position. Before we close the locomotive, we'll also carry out a function check with the housing removed. We'll check our lights on both sides, as well as a programmed additional function that this locomotive enables us to do. After a successful function check, we'll reattach the housing to this locomotive. There's a marking for this on the base frame, which is also located on the locomotive housing. It can be a little tricky to ensure that the center headlight is cleanly threaded. If you don't succeed at the first try, simply lift up the housing and try again. If it's sitting nice and flush, the housing snaps audibly into place so you know it's reattached properly. After closing the locomotive, we'll perform another brief function check. Of course, we need to check both sides to ensure the lights are switching correctly. And while we're at it, we'll also check the additional high beam function.